All right, welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew, and I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this is our last class in our 6-part series on the Garments of the Infinite. So today will be a little bit of a kind of grab bag, a couple of just miscellaneous things that didn't fit so well into any of the other classes, a few summary things, and then I also want to do like tarot and then initiation structure as applications of the tree as just kind of examples of putting it in practice, and talk about some other ways of that it gets put into practice. So a little less structured and tight than some of the other ones. So if anybody has questions about anything at all that we've covered in the series, feel free to jump in. That would be great. And of course, I'm always happy to hang out at the end of the class as well. All right, yeah, let's just jump right into it. All right, so I wanted to open up, this is a bit long, but I think a really beautiful and quote from Israel Regardie's The Tree of Life, which is a book that was really inspiring. It was one of the first books that I ever read on magic, and it was a big inspiration for me. Yeah, so I just wanted to share a quote from that. That book is especially impressive too when you remember that I think he was 24, maybe 25 when he wrote it, which is, yeah, really amazing. So this is a quote here. This is from the end of his chapter on, it's like chapter 3 or 4, I think, in the book, the end of the chapter on Kabbalah. So he's just gotten done talking about the Tree of Life and Kabbalistic ideas. So this quote is all in the context of a Kabbalistic discussion, and it's like at the end of the chapter. So he says, from the theurgical point of view, the whole universe is consciousness, life, and intelligence, embodied in visible and invisible form. Throughout the cosmos, there thrills and vibrates one intelligence, one spiritual consciousness, adumbrated in myriads of sparks or monads, permeating every form, and from which nothing in that cosmos is in any wise exempt. Just as there are various grades of mineral, animal, and vegetable life, and innumerable degrees of intelligence among men, so according to the magical tradition, this same scale of intelligence exists beyond and above man. There are hierarchies of consciousness which are celestial, and there are those which are terrestrial, some divine, others demoniac, and still others including the highest gods and universal essences. This is the pivotal center of the whole of the magical philosophy. It is at one and the same time a monotheism and a polytheism in a single philosophic system. The whole universe is permeated by one life, and that life in manifestation is represented by hosts of mighty gods, divine beings, cosmic spirits, or intelligences. The spiritual state and diversity ascribable to them is great and tremendous. Among them are those deific forces of the rosy dawn of cosmic manifestation, from whom we are sprung, spiritual sparks thrown downwards from their divine essence. So yeah, it's a really kind of beautiful way of thinking about the magical philosophy in general, and especially in terms of the Sephiroth, where there's a unity and there's a diversity, and there's a theory and a structure for thinking about how unity and diversity are related to each other, and while they may appear contradictory, aren't actually. So I think that's a really beautiful lesson that we can learn from the Sephiroth and from study of the Sephiroth, as well as other areas of the magical tradition and philosophy, of course. All right, and so kind of with that in mind, we can jump back in time and I'll look at some very sort of similar comments that Agrippa makes in 3 books of occult philosophy. So this whole chapter is really great. I actually considered kind of going through the whole chapter. His chapters are fairly short. There's just like 3 or 4 pages, but I'll just give you a few excerpts here. All right, so this is from chapter 10 of book 3. I really encourage you to read the whole chapter. So chapter 10 is of the divine emanations, right, meaning the Sephiroth, which the Hebrews called numerations, right? Numerations is, again, the literal translation of Sephiroth. Let's see, so which the Hebrews call numerations, other attributes, the Gentiles, gods, and deities. He means the classical pagans. And of the 10 Sephiroth and 10 most sacred names of God, which rule them in the interpretation of them. All right, so Agrippa says, first of all, you have to remember that Agrippa is coming from a Christian point of view. I mean, it's a kind of a heretical Christian point of view, but he is coming from a Christian point of view. So he says, God himself, though he be Trinity in persons, right, referring to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he yet is but one simple essence. Notwithstanding, we doubt not, but that there are in him many divine powers, which as beams flow from him, which the philosophers of the Gentiles call gods, the Hebrew masters numerations, we name attributes. As wisdom, which Orpheus calls Pallas, right, referring to Athena, Understanding, which he Mercury, which Orpheus, and when he's saying Orpheus here, he means like he's talking about the Orphic hymns, which were ascribed to Orpheus. Let's see. Which Orpheus calls understanding, which Orpheus calls Mercury, the conception of the form, which he Saturn, the productive powers, which he Neptune, the secret nature of things, which he Juno, love, which he Venus, pure life, which he the Sun or Apollo. The matter of the whole world he calleth Pan, the soul as it engendereth things below, contemplative things above, and retracteth into itself. Marcus Varro, in his book of the worship of God, faith, as all souls are reduced to the one. Let me start that over. Marcus Varro, in his book of the worship of God, saith, as all souls are reduced to the one soul of the world or universe, so are all the gods referred to Jupiter, who is the same God, worshipped under diverse names. Therefore, it is meet to know the sensible properties, and perfectly to intellectualize them by way of more secret analogy. Whosoever understandeth truly the hymns of Orpheus and the old magicians shall find that they differ not from the Kabbalistical secrets and orthodox traditions, for whom Orpheus calls curates and unpolluted gods. Dionysus, that's Dionysus the Areopagite, or pseudo-Dionysus the Areopagite, names powers. The Kabbalists appropriate them to the numerations of Pachad, right? And Pachad is an alternate name for the Sepher Yetzirah, that is, to the divine fear. For that which is ensof in the Kabbalah, Orpheus calls. Now there's a misprint here. It's supposed to be night, not might. So which is ensof in the Kabbalah, Orpheus calls night. I think this is a really interesting idea, and I'll talk about this on the next slide. And Typhon is the same with Orpheus as Zamael in the Kabbalah, but the Mecubals, which is another name for the Kabbalists, or maybe just like a school of the Kabbalists. I'm not really clear on that. The Mecubals of the Hebrews, the most learned in divine things, have received the 10 principal names of God as secret divine powers, or as it were members of God, which by 10 numerations, which they call Sephiroth, as it were vestments, right, like garments that we've been talking about. Instruments or exemplars of the archetype have an influence on all things created, through the high things even to the lowest. So again, getting at a similar sort of point that Rigardi is making, though coming from obviously a different like philosophical and cultural standpoint. So I hadn't meant to do this, but that point about Ensof being the same as what Orpheus calls night, I thought was really interesting. And just because we've been talking about the Ensof, I thought maybe we could look at very briefly the Orphic hymn to night. Now, night here in Greek is it's spelled, and her name is the goddess, or really more like a primordial being. She's closer to she's actually like prior to the Titans. She's the direct produced from chaos. And actually in the Orphic hymns, though, she's sometimes referred to as like the oldest of all, as if night is like the primordial principle. But in Greek, it's NYX is usually anglicized. I think in Greek it would be like nux, but my Greek is not great. So anyways, this is just an excerpt from the Orphic hymn to night. It says, I shall sing of night, mother of gods and men. We call night Kypris. Now, Kypris is an epithet of Aphrodite, meaning of Cyprus. The island of Cyprus was often taken as the place of Aphrodite's birth. She was born out of the sea foam and then came ashore in Cyprus, and she had a major cult center in Cyprus as well. So night is being compared to Aphrodite here in that she's like fertile and giving birth. So I shall sing of night, mother of gods and men. We call night Kypris, she gave birth to all. Hear, O blessed goddess, jet black and starlit, for you delight in the quiet and slumber-filled serenity. And so you can see that's a depiction of her there from Gustave Moreau. And classically, she's depicted as being like shrouded in night, or sometimes wearing like a robe of darkness that's often studded with stars. So there's I think a real there's some relationship to the archetype of Nuit here. And I just thought it was so interesting that, that Agrippa makes that connection. All right, and then after that, the rest of chapter 10 of book 3 there, he goes through all 10 Sephiroth. So I'm just going to we'll just do just Kether, just to give you a taste of the type of thing that he's presented, and to see how much of the material that we're about to look at we've already talked about in this class. I think it's nice to be reminded of the continuities and the way that the tradition's been talking about these things for at least 500 years. But again, I encourage you to go and read the rest of that chapter. And if anybody wants, I can send you the PDF of this. Is from the 1650 edition here that we're looking at, which is public domain. So I'm happy to distribute that to anybody who wants it. All right, so about Cather, he's talking about the Sephiroth, and he says, the first of these is the name Aheye, the name of the divine essence. His numeration is called Cather. It's really interesting here. I'm not sure how much this is reflected in the actual Jewish tradition, but in Agrippa and some other kind of Renaissance stuff, it's really the divine names which are primary, and the Sephiroth are secondary to the divine names, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't really present it that way, like in the first class in this series. I think that's a really interesting way to think that it's not that the divine names are attributed to the Sephiroth, but the divine names are first, and then they the numeration of the divine names are the Sephiroth. I think it's an interesting perspective. So anyways, the numeration of Aheye is Cather, which is interpreted a crown or diadem, and signifieth the most simple essence of the divinity. And it is called that which the eye seeth not, and it is attributed to God the Father, and hath his influence by the order of the Seraphinas, or as the Hebrews call them, Hayot HaChadesh, that is, the creatures of holiness, or we usually say living creatures, but same thing, from the vision of Ezekiel, right? And then by the primum mobile, bestows the gift of being to all things, filling the whole universe both through the circumference and the center, whose particular intelligence is called Metatron, right, the archangel of Cather. That is, the prince of faces, or we usually say prince of countenances, like if you remember the microprosopis and macroprosopis, the greater and lesser countenance, whose duty it is to bring others to the face of the prince, and by him the Lord spoke to Moses. So again, a lot of continuity between the way that we still talk about these things and the way that Agrippa talked about them. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here. Again, like I said, this is going to be a bit of a miscellaneous kind of grab bag sort of class. So this is something I debated a little bit about whether or not to present this or not. It's not incredibly important in our tradition, and it's also confusing, but there's this idea of the 7 palaces. Now, the 7 palaces are actually a really early part of Jewish mysticism that even predates the Kabbalah. So the palaces in Hebrew is hekalot, and you'll hear talk about the hekalot literature. It was mystical writings about the 7 palaces, and this is, I don't know exactly what the relationship between the hekalot literature and the Merkabah literature is exactly. I don't know if it's 2 names for the same thing or slightly different but related traditions, but it's the same sort of idea that the Merkabah, the throne chariot, that you ascend through 7 heavens to the throne of God, the throne chariot. Although interestingly, in some of the Merkabah literature, it's actually imagined as a descent rather than an ascent. They seem to talk about ascent and descent almost interchangeably, which is an idea I've been really interested in for a long time. Even Greek philosophy, you see Parmenides, when he goes to meet the goddess, he's taken down, it's a descent into truth. So I'm really interested in that idea of ascent and descent and their kind of equivalence, at least in some circumstances. But anyways, the 7 palaces or sort of 7 heavens, in the highest, is the throne of God. So this is an idea from very early Jewish mysticism, and then it gets sort of taken up into the Kabbalah, and the 10 Sephiroth are sort of reconciled with the 7 palaces. So what I've got here is the basic model of the setup. Let's see, but before we do that, the 7 palaces can be seen in the 3 lower worlds. So you can have the palaces in Asaya, the palaces in Yetzirah, and the palaces in Berea. The palaces in Berea are very sort of high level things, right? I mean, working directly with Berea is what in AA we would think of as adept level work. So, that's a really advanced thing. If you're at that level, you don't need me to talk about it. The palaces in Yetzirah are kind of strange, and there's a lot of kind of numerical sort of stuff happening with gematria, but it isn't really used in our tradition. And then there's some debate about the palaces of Asaya. Crowley presents them as following this sort of model that you see here. But I know Jim Eshelman at least has talked about that the palaces in Asaya should really just be the lower 7 Sephiroth rather than this palace model, and that's actually sort of an error in 777. So I don't know exactly what to think about all that. You can investigate that, but I think what we can talk about here, and it's easy enough to talk about, is just the model of the Sephiroth in the 7 palaces. And then you investigate the details. Jim Eshelman's 776.5 is a good place to start if you're interested in that. You're interested in looking into that more. So anyways, we've got the seven palaces are the seven, you've got one larger circle there, and then the seven somewhat smaller circles. And you'll see that we've got all 10 Sephiroth included in them. So in the highest palace, we've got all three supernals, right? That's Kether, Hokmah, and Bina. And then the middle five palaces are just one Sephiroth each in order, right? So you've got Tefereth in the center, and then Hesed and Gevurah above it, and Netzach and Hod below it. And then the lowest palace encompasses both Yesod and Malkuth. So again, it's thinking about it historically, it's a way of reconciling the earlier, Jewish tradition that focused on 7, and then the later tradition that focuses on the 10. And you'll see it sometimes, or you'll see references to it, so it's helpful to know a little bit what's going on if you see that. But yeah, that's the basic idea. And there's a definite relationship. This actually is in the Jewish tradition already, that the 7 palaces are equated with the 7 planets. It's probably not surprising. And you'll see that if we look at, this is a tracing board from the Alpha et Omega. Alpha et Omega was one of the successors of the Golden Dawn that was led by MacGregor Mathers, at least initially. So if we look at this here, and we've talked about this already, that the planets on the Sephiroth can be put onto the hexagram. So you see that Saturn being attributed to Da'ath there, right? And Da'ath here is it's not so much that Saturn is directly attributed to Da'ath, but that Da'ath can stand in for the whole supernal triad. And then we got Jupiter and Hesed, Mars and Gevurah, Sun and Tefereth, Venus and Netzach, Mercury and Hod, and then Luna and Yesod. As we talked about before, and you can see that you could like superimpose this image onto the palaces, and those correspondences would work exactly. And you'd have kind of Malkuth like brought into Yesod as well, but that's not a big deal, or not a contradiction or anything like that. And again, you'd have all the entire supernals up there attributed to Saturn, where the Da'ath in this diagram is standing in for the whole supernals. So yeah, just something to be aware of if you see it. All right, and then shifting gears again, I just want to talk a little bit about this is more of like a review and sort of summary thing. So first of all, we can look at what the Sephiroth, maybe sort of navigating slightly around the direct question of like, so what are the Sephiroth anyways? I mean, we've been kind of circling around that idea and approaching it from different perspectives, for the last 3 months. But we can talk about them, what they map, what they show, what they sort of correlate to. And there's a few different ways of looking at this. This isn't like an official list or anything like that. This is just my sort of talk about this, or the way that I wanted to talk about it. So the Sephiroth are the map of like the inner structure of the divinity. In Jewish Kabbalah, this would be like the of God, not the absolute essence of God, but the emanations of God, the structure that's created, that God sort of creates within himself in order to begin the process of creation. And so this would be like the Sephiroth and Atziluth, would be like a map of the nature of the divine, at least insofar as humanity can experience it, right? You always have the Ein Sof, which is beyond human experience. But the divinity, as the human mind can even barely comprehend, would be like the Sephiroth in Atziluth. Sephiroth can also map the inner structure of the macrocosm, and by macrocosm here I mean like all of reality, not just physical reality, but everything that exists. All 4 worlds, the entirety of existence. And now you might think that these first 2 things are actually the same thing, and that's perfectly fine. There's no kind of strong opinion one way or another directly in the in this set of teachings for our tradition. All right, and we also have the microcosm, which again can be talked about in 2 different ways. This is either like the physical elemental universe. Classically it would be just the planet Earth, everything below the moon, in a geocentric cosmology. But for us, we could say like the physical universe, the manifest universe. And then we can also think about the microcosm as the individual self. So while the Sephiroth map everything that is, they also map the individual self, or they map like the manifest world. And again, this is a really powerful and important manifestation of the principle of as above, so below. The microcosm is I like to think of it as like homologous, like having the same structure as the macrocosm. I like to think of the idea of like like holograms. If you know anything about holograms, if you have a hologram, and you rotate it, you can see whatever, imagine it's like a hologram of a chair or something. Not a very exciting hologram, but you could, rotate it and see the chair from different angles as you rotate the hologram. And then if you break that hologram into pieces, each piece of the hologram will show the entire chair, but from a smaller range of perspectives. Right? It's not like you'll never get one piece that will show like just the leg of the chair. Each one will have the whole chair, but not from the full range of perspectives that the whole hologram would have. And so that always seems to be a nice way of thinking about microcosm and macrocosm, where the macrocosm is like the complete, unbroken hologram, and then microcosms are like individual fragments of it. And so they repeat the structure of the whole. They're not partial, but they're from like a particular perspective. I don't know, I think that's a nice way of thinking about microcosms. Like, I'm a microcosm, like I'm one perspective on the divine, and you're a different microcosm. You're a different perspective on the divine, right? And so each human is like a different, slightly different view, or not even each human, but every living being, every sentient being, possibly everything that exists, is a different view on the image of the whole, which I think is a really nice way of thinking about microcosm and macrocosm. And the Sephiroth are sort of perfect for this. When you think about the way that we looked at an entire tree of life inside of each Sephiroth that has a very kind of fractal or like holographic feel to it. So yeah, that's the way I like to think about it. And then finally, the path of initiation. And it's important to see why the path of initiation wouldn't really be a very good path of initiation if it wasn't the same map as the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's important that the initiatory path and the structure of initiation is the same as the structure of the microcosm and the structure of the macrocosm. That's an idea, I think, to meditate on, because if you really see the necessity of that truth, I think that's a really big or a really helpful insight into some of the real like core of our tradition. It's difficult to state directly, but you can have a kind of insight about why that has to be the case. I think that'll really help a lot. So good thing to meditate on. All right, and then I also want to look at the Sephiroth sort of in theory and practice, right? So the Sephiroth in theory, and as we've been doing for the last 3 months, the Sephiroth can talk about philosophy, can talk about like metaphysics, what sort of things exist, what are their natures, what are the relationships between the higher and more abstract levels of existence and the lower like physical levels of existence. How do we gain knowledge about things like epistemology? How do we know about things? How does the human mind find truth? What is the path to truth? Also theology, right? Like what is the nature of God? Like in those Regardi quotes and in Agrippa as well, right? You have that idea about the sort of the hard like duality between like polytheism and monotheism is sort of a false duality, right? That it encompasses both. And then Crowley takes that even further, where for Crowley, it's not only that polytheism and monotheism are kind of equated, but even atheism is brought in there too. Many gods, one God, and no God all become sort of irrelevant to the adept, that the actual truth is beyond, and either beyond those three or encompasses all three of those positions. So Sepher, I think, are a really important contribution to theology. And reading like theological literature and things like that is so different once you've had a couple of years of study of the Sephiroth. And then also theosophy. And again, this isn't like talking about the Theosophical Society, but the broader sense of theosophy as like the wisdom of God and the understanding of the inner processes of God. Especially associated with people like Jakob Berma, right, is very associated with theosophy, because he actually talks about like the inner processes that like occur like within God before the creation even begins, which classical or traditional philosophy would sort of err on. There's a sense that like philosophy is the love of wisdom, but theosophy is more like directly presenting that wisdom or something, right? Like sometimes you'll see like Hegel gets attacked for no longer being a philosopher, but having become a theosopher, right? He's not just pursuing wisdom, but he claims to have it. But the Qabalistic tradition, and the Sephiroth in particular, I think can do both and can unite those two things. And then finally, we also have like the coordination of symbol sets. As we've seen, you can bring in lots of different things onto the Sephiroth, and then you can use the Sephiroth as a kind of like a translation scheme, where you've got two different sets of symbols. If you can kind of look at where each one would be on the tree, you can then figure out a relationship between those two sets of symbols. So it's a really nice way of being able to look at equivalencies, and especially when we're looking at different traditions and things like that, it's important to be careful about that and not to be overly quick about saying, oh, this God is exactly the same as this God or something like that. It's important to be considerate and nuanced and flexible about all that sort of stuff. But it is incredibly useful that we can coordinate between different traditions and different sets of symbols using the Sephiroth. And then that point is a little bit blurry between theory and practice, maybe. But then things that are more clearly in practice, the Sephiroth can be used for ritual design. Both, you could do a particular ritual using like the Sephirothic correspondences, and you can also use like the structure of the tree for like a ritual. You could do a ritual where you like ascend, up the middle pillar, or ascend from one Sephiroth to another, things like that. There's lots of ways that the Sephiroth, in an unlimited number of ways, or only limited by your own sort of creativity and insight of how these things could be used to actually practically structure magical rituals. And again, correspondences too, like we spent a couple hours looking at 2 weeks ago. That's all very practical as well. Speaking of the class 2 weeks ago, after I know I went on for like almost 2 hours, but after, like in the next 48 hours after that class, I kept thinking like, oh, I forgot to say this. I didn't point out that. We went way over, and there was still so much more that could have been said. So please just be aware that last class, as long as it was and in depth as it was still only a very, very surface and kind of partial tour through the Sephiroth. There's an unlimited amount of depth, which is great news if you love this stuff. All right, and then next, the Sephiroth teach, I think, really important lessons about balance. We've talked a lot about that with mercy and severity, like the high and the low. All these ideas are really well balanced by the Sephiroth and show, I think the Sephiroth help to teach the lessons about the necessity of balance and the necessity of, like Crowley talks about the idea of developing all your faculties equally. Eventually you might find that some of your faculties are natural, you're naturally able to develop in a certain direction more than in others, but that shouldn't be, you shouldn't start off in the process of self-development with saying, well, I'm just going to develop this thing I'm already good at, I'm just going to develop that. There should be an attempt to develop all of your capacities. And again, we think about the Sephiroth, you're like, well, I'm just going to focus on Gevurah. It's a bad idea. Like, the point is that they're all need to be together and functioning harmoniously and in a balanced way. Yeah. And then Crowley also has, I'd actually like to talk about this a lot more like in a future class, but Crowley talks about a technique called the ladders, which it's kind of a dialectical technique. You take two like ideas, like with the existence of God is a good one. So we've been talking about that, like there is a God, there is no God, and somehow you kind of like ram these things into each other or let them sort of negate each other in order to ascend to a higher level. And then at that higher level, then you find, okay, like what's the negation of that thing? And then you let those things destroy each other, and then you ascend to a higher level, and you just sort of continue this process of constantly negating every idea or equating every idea with its opposite, seeing that, no God is the same as God, that there being a purpose to existence is the same as there being no purpose to existence. Free will is the same as fate. All these sorts of ideas of always like negating the opposites in order to ascend. And we can see that in the Tree of Life. You could think of like a polarity, like Hod and Netzach. If you can transcend the polarity of Hod and Netzach, you end up in Tefereth. And then from Tefereth, this is like an upward path, right? And then Tefereth, you can kind of like trace back into its original polarity of like Gevurah and Hesed, and then do the same sort of process and rising up the tree. And I think that kind of dialectical action is really important, not just like a philosophical dialectic, but actually as a magical practice of raising consciousness higher and higher to get beyond all sets of dualities. And then, psychology as well. We talked a little bit about, like the parts of the soul and some other like psychological ideas. And so it can be really helpful to think of yourself and your own mind in terms of the Sephiroth. And David, a bit of you, a lot of are familiar with it already. There's a really great episode of Living Thelema where David Shoemaker really presents this idea about the idea that if you're having a problem at a certain level, you need to be able to identify what level that problem is. And then to solve that problem or to work with it, you need to go up to a higher level. So if you can say like, oh, the thing I'm struggling with seems to be, involve like correspondences or symbols with, this particular part of the tree, you could then look at, like what's the Sephiroth right above that or what's going on just above that level, and then approach that level from from the next stage up, rather than trying to come at it from the bottom or being right in the place where the problem is. So that can be a really important like psychological principle of always seeking the higher principle and seeking to try to reconcile and heal the lower by means of the higher. And of course, that starts to really bleed into magical practice as well, right? That you're invoking higher powers to influence lower things. Also, as a memory palace, some of you may be familiar with the ideas of memory palaces, like from Giordano Bruno or the Renaissance tradition. These ideas of these like mental structures that you use. The most practical level is just to increase the memory, but like in Bruno and in others, it really becomes a magical practice of like creating these really intricate, complex models of the cosmos and of existence, like inside of your mind. And I found that to be a very powerful thing with the Sepher, that the more the correspondences are really internalized and memorized and made like a part of who you are, the more that, I found my memory improves. I don't know, there's a transformative effect to that, to develop those powers of memory and when the organization of the contents of the mind. That's something Crowley talks about a lot too, that we should organize and coordinate our own, all the sort of diversity of different things happening inside of our, inside of our inner experience, that the Sephiroth can be used to organize all that stuff. And we can build up more and more and more, adding, more correspondences and more layers and more ideas until we have this, incredibly sort of vast and intricate inner system. Which is a very magical thing, I think. All right, and then, organization of experience, I just talked about that. And then initiation, which we will be talking about as we go on. At the end, we'll talk about the way that the Sephiroth are employed for initiation structures. All right, so let's pivot again and talk about the tarot. You may have noticed, and I may have mentioned it, that I completely avoided mention of the tarot in the preceding classes. And I did this because I think that trying to understand the Sephiroth through the tarot can be misleading and not very helpful. But once you have the Sephiroth like built up and you have some familiarity with the tarot, then looking at the correspondences and the, again, kind of structural homology between the tarot and the Sephiroth are then really useful. But I wouldn't like rely on it too much to understand what the Sephiroth are. All right, so we can kind of read this chart. I hope this is helpful. We can read the chart from left to right here. So you got 78 cards in the tarot deck, and that's divided first into the 22 major arcana. Now, the 22 major arcana on the tree just correspond with the 22 paths, and that's what we covered in the Paths, Letters, and Correspondences series, right? So then the 56 minor arcana are divided into the 4 suits of wands, cups, swords, and discs. And then each suit is divided into, the 10, ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the 4 court cards as well. And so the ace through 10, can correspond to the Sephiroth, and then the suits can correspond, they can correspond to a number of things. And we'll talk about this more on a couple of coming slides, can correspond to like the 4 worlds. So, like the ace through 10 of wands is like Kether through Malkuth in Atziluth. Right, and then the court cards, which we'll talk about this in the next slide, can relate to the Tetragrammaton and the Partsufim, either in that world, and then we can also do sub-elements of the main element, which, again, we'll talk about this in just a minute. But anyways, this is just a little summary of the structural kind of homologies between the tarot and the Tree of Life. And I think especially with talking about like the ace through 10 of the tarot in relationship to the Sephiroth, some of them can be kind of misleading. Like, if you look at the 5s or the 9s or something like that, well, the 5s maybe, but like the 9s don't really describe, the 9 of swords, something like that. I don't really feel like that's actually about Yesod in some way, or it's not a very useful way of thinking about Yesod. But I think the connection, that's the point I wanted to make. I think the connection there is that they can both be related to like kind of Pythagorean stuff, right? You're still looking at these archetypal ideas of counting from 1 to 10. And so the Sephiroth, relate to that, and the tarot also relate to that. But I would be, cautious about directly equating like the Sephiroth to the numbered cards in the tarot. And of course, there's other things happening too, like the decans as well, are bringing extra symbolism in there. So they're not even pure representations of the Sephiroth. So yeah, that's all I'll say about the ace through 10 of the suits. That's something you can explore on your own. And again, I think it's interesting to look at the kind of correspondence between those things, but I wouldn't rely on it too much. But what I want to spend a little more time talking about is the court cards and their relationship to a bunch of the things that we've been talking about. So this is a slide you've seen before in the 4th class, about a month ago. This is the parts of theme. And so I just want to remind you that especially the relationship between the parts of theme and the tetragrammaton and the tree of life. And so the main thing we're going to be looking at here is the 4 main parts of theme in our tradition of father, mother, son, and daughter. And so we see the father, is attributed to Chokmah and to the letter Yod. The mother is attributed to Binah and the first Hey of the tetragrammaton. Now the son is Hesed through Yesod, and is most especially Tefereth. And that's related to the vow of tetragrammaton. And then finally, in Malkuth, I don't know any traditional sources that specifically refer to like the parts of theme of Malkuth as the daughter, but it's not at all a stretch or anything like that. If you look at the pattern, right, you have father, mother, son, or you have father, mother, son, and then you have the female, the bride, the queen. Especially when you remember that the son, especially the son as Tefereth, is associated with the king. So you got the king and the king is the son, and the queen is, right, very naturally the daughter. So I don't think that's any kind of stretch there. What did I do? Here. Okay, so yeah, here's father, mother, son, and daughter. Again, the main 4 parts of theme that we use in our tradition, and you can really see how the macroprosopis, the Ancient of Days in Kether, sort of differentiates into father and mother, and Chokmah and Binah, and then the father and mother produce, by their union, the son and the daughter. And the daughter is kind of like the final product, the end result, the thing that's created. And then I like to think of the son as sort of like the intermediary process, like everything that has to happen between the union of the supernal father and mother, and then the final result of creation, the son as being almost mercurial or something like that in its function of mediating between the supernals and the world in the process of creation, and both up and down. Right, there's a lot of talk about how the son kind of like descends to the daughter and then raises, through the initiatory process, raises the daughter, the Hey final, up to the mother, the first Hey. And it's a pattern we've talked about in some of the previous classes. Now we can also see, the tetragrammaton and the parts of theme also related to the elements and to the 4 worlds, as again we've been talking about. So this is really just a review here. The Yod is fire, and in the world of Atziluth, the first Hey is water, in the world of Berea, vow is air, in the world of Yetzirah, and then Hey final is earth in the world of Asaya. All right, so we now look at the tarot here. So you can look at the tetragrammaton and the court cards, and I've kind of arranged them as a grid where you can see that both the columns and rows can be attributed to the tetragrammaton. Right, so the rows there are like the suits, right? You have the suit of wands, which we can attribute to Yod, the suit of cups we can attribute to Hey, right? And obviously that's Yod, that's fire. And then the suit of cups, that's Hey and water. Vow is Yetzirah and air, and then Hey final is discs, is earth and Asaya. And then the 4 like persons, which I'm suggesting are basically the parts of theme in our tradition, are also related to that Yod Hey Vav Hey, as we just saw in the previous slides. So there's a couple of different ways that we can think about this. The 4 persons, again, as I've been suggesting, are like the parts of theme, or even just the letters, the tetragrammaton. You could think about this as like the spelling of tetragrammaton, or the tetragrammaton in each of the 4 worlds. That the 4 court cards of wands are like the tetragrammaton in Atziluth, and the 4 court cards in cups are like the tetragrammaton in Berea, right, and so on. And also just as the elements, of course, too, right? I mean, the wands are fire, cups are water, swords are air, and discs are earth, right? And that I think is more useful, especially in actual divinatory tarot. Thinking about wands as being absoluthic is really not very useful. If you're doing a reading for somebody about something that's like going on in their life or something like that, it's unlikely that that yod of absoluth, which is practically the Godhead itself, is going to be particularly relevant to a question about their job or their love life or something like that, right? I mean, it might be, but that's probably not going to be your first place to go. This is more of a deeper esoteric interpretation and like a structural homology, as I keep saying. So one thing we can do, if we look at both the rows and columns as elements, we get the 16 sub-elements. So here, let's move on here. So here we've got the court cards in the suit of wands. I scanned these images from my own tarot deck. You'll notice the titles are in German. This is from the Swiss version of the deck, which is a lot more color accurate than the US Games version. And well, I don't want to get off on a rant, but US Games really should not have the copyright to that deck. OTO should, but OTO does not have the money to be able to take them to court. So US Games continues to publish it. And it's not just that that the US Games version of the deck is it's just not some very high quality images or something like that. They're actually modified. The colors are oversaturated, and you lose a lot of detail, and some of the colors are distorted. They're really not accurate representations of Frida Harris's beautiful artwork, and sort of intentionally so. They've intentionally modified them. It took a little while for me to get used to using the Swiss deck after having used the US Games deck for a while. But once I did switch, the US Games deck now looks pretty bad to me. But anyways, that was all a tangent here. So anyways, we got the court cards in the suit of wands. And so, again, as we've been saying, we think of it as the part suffime, right? So the knight corresponds to the father. Now, again, Crowley uses the knight here for the father, and a lot of other Golden Dawn decks, this would be king rather than knight. But I think Crowley likes the kind of chivalric or Arthurian sort of romance ideas that the knight brings in. So he kind of substitutes out knight for king, whereas in some older decks, the knight is maybe more like what Crowley calls the prince. So that can be kind of a confusing thing. Another thing to be aware of with the court cards too is that there's a real change. The court cards are actually kind of modified based on Kabbalistic theory, right? You'll know, in the Marseille deck, right? You have the king and the queen, and then the knight and the page, but they don't really correspond so well to the part suffime, and they don't have quite the same this hierarchical structure that we've been talking about here. So this is, in my understanding, anyways, this is sort of a modification of the Tarot de Marseille based on the esoteric or occultist interpretation of the tarot, which is something I'm sure a lot of you have heard me talk about before. Although again, it's worth saying that there are a variety of opinions of that. I mean, there are traditions that say that some of this stuff was inner tradition for a long time, that there were secret traditions that weren't public knowledge until the 19th century. There's not a lot of documentation for that, but it's a legitimate point of view. I try to stick a little bit closer to the documented sort of history, but it's not the only thing out there. So another thing we can look at here is the sub-elements, right? So the entire suit of wands is attributed to fire, but then if we remember that this is the yod hey vav, reading right to left here, yod hey vav hey, we can also do sub-elements. So the knight of wands would be the fiery part of fire. The queen of wands would be the watery part of fire. The prince of wands would be the airy part of fire, and the princess of wands would be the earthy part of fire. So each element itself can be divided up into the four elements, which is another really beautiful, I think, kind of fractal holographic idea here. Yeah. And another nice thing about the sub-elements as well is, I don't want to get into it the Enochian tablets, but if you're familiar with the Enochian tablets, you know that the four tablets are each attributed, in the Golden Dawn tradition anyways, are each attributed to one of the four elements, and then the four quadrants of the tablet are attributed to the sub-elements. So there's a really nice way that the court cards have the same. I mean, the Enochian tablets have all kinds of other stuff going on too, but there's a real relationship between the court cards and the structure of the Enochian tablets too, which, especially if you've done magical work with those tablets or anything like that, that can be a very powerful thing. All right, so now we'll go through the rest of these fairly quickly. Knight of Cups would be the fiery part of water. The Queen of Cups would be the watery part of water, right? Like almost like the essence of water, right? That is which is most watery within water. Prince of Cups, the airy part of water, and then the Princess of Cups, the earthy part of water. And so, how to think about these things, like what is the fiery part of water? Maybe like natural metaphors can sometimes be helpful. Like the fiery part of water would be like water in a very like rapid, violent action, like like a typhoon or something like that, right? Then the earthy part of water, it might be like ice or stagnant water or still water, or like an aquifer or something like that. We can think about what like water in an earthy mode would be, what water in an airy mode would be. Water in an airy mode might be like vapor or clouds, right? So like those types of natural metaphors I think can be helpful. And we can also think about them sort of qualitatively too, right? About like a bit of a blending, right? Like a fiery part of water would be, it's basically water, but it will have some similarities with fire, or will be a little bit closer to fire. Yeah, Kristen's pointing out that this is similar to the way that the tattvas are the seeds of the other elements, or I didn't say that very well, but yeah, I know what you mean, Kristen. And yeah, right. And the tattvas get combined with each other in a very, very similar way. Yeah, exactly. All right, and then the court cards in the suit of swords. So again, this would be the fiery part of air, watery part of air, airy part of air, and then earthy part of air. And then the court cards of the suit of discs would be the same 4 elements in earth. And so it's nice if you have the Thoth deck to really kind of meditate on each one of those images, and think about them as the parts theme too. They think about this as father, mother, son, and daughter, and about their relationships to the tree of life. As Hokmah, Bina. Then the princess as Malkuth, and the son as everything between Malkuth and the supernals. It can be a nice meditation and a nice way of approaching the parts of theme. I think that the Jewish tradition has lots of other ways of talking about the parts of theme, but I really think that in the like in Hermetic Kabbalah, the main way that we, or the first way that we look at the parts of theme is really through the court cards. There's also, as we talked about a little bit 2 weeks ago, there's also a definite relationship between the parts of theme and the kind of thelemic deities of like Babylon and the beast and the daughter of Babylon and the crowned and conquering child. Those absolutely have a relationship to the parts of theme as well. But that's specifically within the thelemic tradition. All right. Yeah. So let's pivot again here. We're doing pretty well on time. So yeah, again, if anybody has any questions or anything like that, please feel free to jump in. Because I don't think I have another 40 minutes worth of stuff here, though. I'm sure I can talk for 40 minutes. Oh, thanks, Joe. That's very kind of you. All right, yes, let's pivot again and talk about the Sephiroth and the path of initiation, which, again, like the tarot, I want to suggest is an application of the tree and an application of the Sephiroth, rather than being something that is like necessarily inherent to them. It's one way of applying them. And that's something, sometimes I see that we'll talk a lot about the grades in just a minute. Sometimes I see the grade structures being like overly equated with the Sephiroth. And yeah, again, I think we should be careful with that. And remember, this is one application of this structure. So here you've got in the middle there, you got the sword and serpent diagram, the lightning flash and the serpent of wisdom, which we talked about, was that in the 3rd class, I think? So again, as we talked about there in more detail, the lightning flash or the flaming sword is the 10 Sephiroth in descending order, right? The instantaneous manifestation from Kether to Hokmah to Bina, all the way down to Malkuth. And then the serpent of wisdom climbs in the reverse order and climbs up the paths. So you can think of the flaming sword as like the process of creation and the process of manifestation, and also the magic as well can be thought of as magic in the sense of like theurgy is really closer to mysticism, but magic in the sense of like trying to produce change either within yourself or within the world. We can think about that as being related to the process of the flaming sword, the descent. You contact the highest power and then bring that down into the lower worlds. But the initiatory path and the mystical path is the path of the serpent of wisdom, the climb back up the tree. So All right, so we're going to talk about a few. I think it's helpful kind of to look at this in stages because it'll get more and more complex as we go along. If we start right out with the AA grades, there's a lot there and it can be a little overwhelming. So before even the Golden Dawn, there's some Rosicrucian orders like I'm going to completely blank on the name there, but some of the kind of predecessor orders to the Golden Dawn, which like Kenneth Mackenzie was a member of, which almost certainly influenced the foundation of the Golden Dawn. They coming kind of out of like a Masonic tradition of having these like graded like degree structures. You start out at the first degree, the second degree, the third degree, like in Masonry, and then adding. Obviously, you have additional grades as well added in some of the. Like Scottish Rite and or the York Rite and all that. So they have that this idea of like these like graded degree structures, which have ancient precedents too. Like the Mithraic mysteries had like a 7-level graded structure where you start out at the bottom and then you like ascend up the 7 levels, and those are like equated with the planets. And you also have the idea like in the Hermetic tradition and in the Gnostic tradition as well of the process of like spiritual work as being like the ascent up the spheres, right? So you start in the earthly sphere, and then you ascend to the sphere of the moon, and then you ascend to the sphere of Mercury, and then to the sphere of Venus, right? All the way to the top, eventually with the goal of ascending beyond the sphere of Saturn. And now for a lot of them, this was, and including some of the theurgists, this process was also the process of freeing yourself from fate, because the planets are what determines fate. And so if you can get above the planets, then the planets no longer have the fated influence. And we're talking about astrology here, right? The planets no longer have the same deterministic influence that they would on someone who hadn't done this work. So this idea of like an ascent up the levels like this is absolutely an ancient idea. And then so in the Masonic tradition, you also have this idea of the graded degree structures. And so some of the Rosicrucian orders, like maybe starting in like late 18th century into 19th century, start using the tree of life as a way of doing degree structures. So this is what's usually often called like the Rosicrucian grades. Again, this doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of the Rosicrucian tradition, likely, at least as far as we know, but is like a later kind of quasi-Masonic development. So what we're doing here is, as you might expect, we're starting at the bottom of the tree and ascending upwards. So what you've got here in the tree diagram, you'll see we got like this, 1 degree equals 10, 2 equals 9, 3 equals 8. And the degree symbol there refers to the grade. And then I don't know if there's actually a name for it, but the little like square symbol there, that's referring to the number of the Sephiroth. So for Malkuth, we have 1 equals 10. That's the first grade is the 10th Sephiroth. And then you would advance from Malkuth to Yesod, and then the second degree, the second grade, would be the 9th Sephiroth, up until the very end of the system where the 10th degree would be the first Sephiroth. And then each one of those are given names. The 1 equals 10 is given the name Zealoter. That's the idea of being like, zealous and fervent. The 2 equals 9 grade is called Theoricus, right? Theoricus, being the root of the word theory. Practicus, one who practices. Philosophus, like a philosopher. And then this is broken up into separate orders. And so the lower 4 grades are called the first order. And then the middle 3 grades, attributed to that middle triad on the tree, are the second order, and this is Adeptus Minor, the minor adept, then the major adept, and the exempt adept. And then finally, we have a third order, which at least in some, I don't know exactly what the conception would have been in the earliest versions of this, but at least in the Golden Dawn and some others, you have the idea that the third order is not, there's no like living humans in the third order. The third order is beyond like manifest humanity. Though at least by the time we get to Crowley, that has changed, right? As I'm sure you all know, Crowley claimed all of these grades all the way up to Ipsissimus. So let me see, where was I going with this? Okay, one thing to think about here too is the way that the paths get brought in. So if you're down here in Malkuth, you've just entered the order fairly recently, and you've been working on Malkuth-related things, and then you're going to be initiated to the next grade. You rise up this path. This is the path of Tav. So you rise up the path of Tav to get to Yesod, and now you're in the second degree attributed to Yesod. And you do that work, and you move on, and now you rise not just up the path of Shin here to get to Hod, but you also rise that's the path of Resh, excuse me. That's the path of Resh. This is the path of Shin. So not only the path of Resh, but also the path of Shin. You ascend up both of those paths to attain to Hod. And then to move from Hod to Netzach, you would ascend up not just Pe, but also Zadi and Kof. So the paths show the process of transitioning and how you sort of get from one Sephiroth to another is by means of the path. And so all of that symbolism, is absolutely incorporated in the structure of the rituals, what the grade work assigned and all of that stuff. Yeah, okay, let's just move on here. So now the Golden Dawn pick up this structure and add a few additional elaborations. Yeah, so what they add is a couple of intermediate grades. So you'll see below Malkuth now, we've got a 0 equals 0 grade of neophyte. And the zeros here, I think, just indicate that, I mean, there's, I think, a deeper sort of interpretation of what that means. But the simplest way to think about it is just that, you haven't yet entered into like a specific Sepher. That's a kind of like introductory degree. I was thinking this morning about how to talk about this, and I was thinking that maybe an analogy you could almost use would be like a book, where the Sephiroth are like the 10 big chapters in the book, and then like the 0 degree of neophyte would be like the introduction to the book, where you're introducing the book, but you haven't yet like gotten really into the meat of the material. And then here we've only got one other intermediate degree. We'll see another one on the next slide. But here you've got a degree that comes between the 4th degree of Philosophus and the 5th degree of the Adeptus Minor, called the Portal, or the Portal of the Vault of the Adepts. And this is a transitionary degree between the lower 4 Sephiroth and between the first order and the second order. So this is like a transitionary grade that isn't specifically attributed to any of the the Sephiroth, but what it is attributed to is the veil of Parochith, right, which separates the lower 4 Sephiroth from Tefereth and everything else above it. So the portal is like that veil. Now, symbolically, in the Golden Dawn, the Malkuth grade of Zelator, this is this is largely an Earth-related degree, and so the work you're doing is largely Earth-related. And then in Theoricus, the 2 equals 9 degree of Yesod, you're doing air-related work, and we've seen these elemental correspondences before. And then in Practicus, you're doing water-related work, and in Philosophus, you're doing fire-related work. And then Portal, which is attributed to Spirit, is like the unification of these 4 things. You've worked on the 4 different like parts of who you are, and then you synthesize and unify them, and then the completion of that process is then the move into the second order. So the first order, because it's working elementally, is working with what we call like microcosmic forces, like kind of natural forces, the forces of the world, and then the macrocosmic forces, which would be taught in the second order, would be things like celestial powers, right? So there's also a transition in like the level of work that you're doing between the orders. All right, and then Crowley, when he formulates the AA, takes this same structure, and he confusingly renames a bunch of the grades and also adds one more additional intermediate grade. Now, I have seen some Golden Dawn style like maps of the Tree of Life that includes this. You'll see Babe of the Abyss there in the Abyss is the extra one that's been added here. I have seen a few kind of Golden Dawn maps of the grades that include that Babe of the Abyss. But I sort of assume that that's actually like a later development, that they're getting that from Crowley rather than having existed before Crowley develops that. But I could be wrong about that. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this is Crowley's introduction. So yeah, confusingly, Crowley renamed some of the degrees. So the 0 degree is renamed Probationer, which used to be Neophyte, and now the Malkuth degree is no longer Zelator, but is Neophyte. The Yesod degree is no longer Theoricus, but is Zelator. And then Practicus and Philosophus stay the same. He renames Portal to Dominus Liminus, which means the Lord of the Threshold. And same basic symbolism that the threshold is again that veil of Parochith, the threshold of the greater mysteries, the threshold of the macrocosmic forces, and the also superhuman forces. You can think of the lower 4 Sephiroth as the most human, and that beyond that you start to get into what is beyond human. Now, as individuals, of course, we all encompass the entire tree and all 4 worlds, but our human nature, the mortal nature, maybe is more helpful to say than human. Mortal nature is more like the lower 4 Sephiroth. And I think there is not physical immortality, but I think there is a real sense that that you are seeking an eternal principle, like the soul, that which is never born and never dies. And there's a process of seeking that as something that lies, beyond and behind the transitional, the changing, flux of the mortal world. So yeah, let's, again, we've got plenty of time here. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about how some of this stuff works. One of the really big differences, and this is really interesting to think about too, between the way that the Golden Dawn did this structure and the way that the AA does this structure, is that in the Golden Dawn, you'd be initiated like to the Malkuth degree, and you'd do Malkuth related work. And then when that was finished, you would take an initiation ritual that you'd have like an initiation ritual that correspond not two separate, but sort of two parts of one ritual. The first part would correspond to like the path of Tav, and then the second part would correspond to Yesod. And the work you'd be doing in that grade would be largely related to Yesod, right? So you do the work of the grade you're in, then you are sort of ritually ascend up the path, and then to the next grade. But Crowley changes this. What Crowley does is gives you not only work related to the Sephra that you're currently, that your grade is currently attributed to, but also work of the paths that lead to the next one. So the Malkuth grade is a little confusing because there's some extra stuff like added in. But so let's talk about the Yesod grade of Zealoter. So you're in Yesod, this is 2 = 9 grade of Zealoter. And so you're not only working on Yesod related things in your practices, and right, if we think about like what the AA practices are. Actually, yeah, let's step back a minute. Some of the AA practices for Malkuth, a lot of these are really like foundational practices. Okay. Actually, let me save this until we get to the next slide. But yeah, so you're doing like, Malkuth is just like a lot of complex stuff here. You're doing like Malkuth related practices, in Malkuth, and then also doing practices, that relate to the paths that lead to the next grade. So again, Malkuth is a little strange because you actually sort of work the paths of Sheen and Kof sort of before you fully work them. But the main work is Malkuth and Tav, right? And then you do the work of Tav, and then you're like initiated to Yesod. So you do like the path work before you're initiated to the next grade rather than as part of your initiation to the next grade. I hope that makes sense. So then again, like in Zealoter, in the 2 = 9 grade of Yesod, you'd be not only doing Yesod related work, which is a lot of foundational like Raja Yoga type stuff, right? Asana, pranayama, some dharana, the things related to, related to the correspondences of Yesod and to air and to the moon. And then at the same time as you're doing that, or at the same time, but in that grade, in the Zealoter grade, you're also doing practices related to the paths of Sheen and Resh. And then that path continues. You're working the paths ahead. You're working the paths of where you're going, rather than the Golden Dawn, which you sort of only work the place that you are. Yeah, so we can talk a little bit, I guess, about how this actually unfolds in AA. Actually, I'm gonna go to the next slide and then we'll come back to that. I think that'll be helpful because there's one other thing that we need to talk about here that is really confusing, and I see people get this wrong all the time and get confused about this. And I think if you can get this idea, I think that will that'll be really helpful for you. All right, so again, on the left here, I'm just sort of simplifying back to the Rosicrucian grades. The other grades there, like Probationer and Dominus Liminis and Babe of the Abyss, those are really like either introductory degrees or like transitional degrees. These are really like the main degrees, and just so for simplicity's sake, we can look at just the 10 like primary degrees rather than the transitional or introductory ones. So the grades are attributed to the Golden Dawn, 1 = 10, 2 = 9, 3 = 8, and the AA, 1 = 10, 2 = 9, 3 = 8. They're attributed to the same Sephiroth, but the worlds that you're operating in are not the same. So you'll see I've got like the grades, and then what world that grade is in the Golden Dawn, and then what world that's in the AA. So you'll see in the Golden Dawn, the first 4 degrees, which correspond to the first order, below Tefereth, that's all within the world of Asaya. So it's like Malkuth of Asaya, Yesod of Asaya, Hod of Asaya, and Netzach of Asaya. And then the transition between the first order and the second order is not only the transition between like Netzach and Tefereth, but is also the transition between Asaya and Yetzirah. So you're moving like up a world in that transition, which is part of why that transition is so important, and why you have like a break between the first order and the second order in that part, is it's a transition between worlds. Again, thinking about what that means, like a transition between worlds. Again, you all sentient beings, and possibly all things that exist, all encompass all 4 worlds and all of the Sephiroth. It's more of a question of what you're consciously aware of, what you have conscious access to, and where you can actually, like choose to operate, and where you have the power to operate. So again, we think of Asaya is often talked about as like the material world. It's not that if you're in like Asaya, that you have no access to the mental realm or something like that. I mean, obviously, you do have access to Yetzirah, the world of ideas and thought forms, especially insofar as those things are beyond like an individual. Like we talk about those sorts of ideas, like the mental realm, the mental space, all that is like Yetzirah. And so it's not like you don't have access to those things before you're in a grade attributed to Yetzirah, but that you're not fully conscious of it, not fully aware of what it is, and you don't fully operate comfortably there. So once you've been, if you've done this or in the process of doing this, you'll see that when you actually make that transition between like Asaya and Yetzirah, there really is a very real shift in the way that you relate to and can operate on that Yetziratic sort of mental astral level. Okay, but then what happens in AA is the worlds are shifted. So the only AA grade that is directly attributed to Asaya, again, sort of ignoring the introductory grades of probationer, and actually there's even like the student grade before you even really begin the probational work, but sort of ignoring those. The only AA grade that's attributed to Asaya is Malkuth. And then with the advancement to Yesod in the 2 = 9 grade, that is the transition from Asaya to Yetzirah. So where the Golden Dawn made that transition between like the 4th degree and the 5th degree, the AA makes that transition between the 1st degree and the 2nd degree. And so one way you can think about this is that essentially the entire Golden Dawn first order has been collapsed into Malkuth. So the neophyte of AA is essentially doing all of the work of the the full range of work of what the entire like first order of a Golden Dawn based order would be doing. Right, and you can see how well that works. It's not just like a change. It's that as we talked about, the first 4 grades in the Golden Dawn system are elemental, right? You work on earth, you work on air, you work on water, you work on fire, right? But all 4 elements can also, like in the cosmological scheme as we've been talking about it, all 4 of those elements are Malkuth, right? Malkuth is the world of the elements. And so in the AA grade, you're working the world of the elements all in Malkuth. And then when you move to Yesod, you're now beginning to work with what's the word I'm looking for? Like celestial powers. That which is like beyond, or macrocosmic powers, right? Beyond the microcosm. So that, like planetary magic is a good example of like macrocosmic work. Right, so it's all that Golden Dawn first order, first 4 grades are like concentrated in Malkuth. Now, okay, so then for the Golden Dawn, then the 3 adept grades, from the 5th, 6th, and 7th degree, those are all in Yetzirah. And then now in the original Golden Dawn, the 6th and 7th degrees, I believe, were developed by the Alpha et Omega. And then there was often the idea that there wasn't like a formal initiation to the 8th degree and to the world of Berea. So that's sort of like beyond, like you had kind of finished the Golden Dawn system. And then your work that you then had to pursue was how to get from, like Hesed to Binah, how to get from Yetzirah to Berea. But there wasn't like a formal method for this, at least early on. But Crowley changes a lot of this stuff with AA and with his insight that it's the like the sacred magic of the Brahman, the working for the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. That's like a formal method for making the transition between Yetzirah and Beriah, and really full conscious access to at will access to Beriah is basically a synonym for knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. That really means the same thing. And so, I don't know, over the years of interacting with Thelemites and the Thelemic community, especially online, which I mostly avoid now as much as possible, I've seen so much abuse of the term like holy guardian angel and misuse of it and stuff that it's become hard for me to think of that term as being like like a truly sort of sacred thing, and that people use it to mean so many different things and in such a confusing way that I think it's helpful to have that like really technical definition that what that is full conscious ability to access and operate in Beriah. That's like a good hard like formal way of thinking about that. So, but what this also means is that so for AA then in the second, third, and fourth degrees, you're working in the world of Yetzirah, and then the transition between the fourth degree and the fifth degree, through the Dominus Liminus, the intermediate degree, that is also the transition between Yetzirah and Beriah, and it's in Tifereth, of course, that the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel is sought and needs to be attained before you can move on. And so one thing that this means is that what an adept is, now you become an adept at the fifth degree, at the Tifereth degree. But what an adept is means something completely different in the Golden Dawn system and in the AA system. In the Golden Dawn system, an adept is someone who has like full conscious access to the world of Yetzirah and can operate there in an especially effective manner. But an adept in the AA sense is someone who has full conscious access and can operate in Beriah, right, which is something much higher. So, when people say, oh, I'm an adept or this person is an adept, it's really important to think, well, adept in the Golden Dawn sense or adept in the AA sense. It's not like one is right or wrong. It's just two different ways of using that word, but it leads to so much confusion in people. So getting clear on that, I think, is very helpful. So yeah, I'm just going to jump back here for a second. And we can talk, just a little bit more about, let's talk about the Babe of the Abyss, actually. I think that's an important thing to be clear on as well. So one of the ideas with the Abyss here, as we've been talking about, is that from Hesed, right, which is attributed to the, or corresponds to the seventh degree, right, the degree of Adeptus Exemptus, there's no path going from Hesed to Binah. Of course, there's paths coming from Gevurah and Tiferet, but symbolically, like there's no path here. And instead, you have to cross. This is the crossing of the abyss. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with that idea, and you can really look into Crowley's work for all the details of that. There's no way that I can summarize it, and of course, I have no personal experience whatsoever with this, so I can only sort of repeat things that I've read and studied here. But this idea of the Babe of the Abyss, this is like the exempt adept has to release everything that they understand to be themselves, even beyond the human level, even that adept consciousness, the holy guardian angel and the union with the holy guardian angel, all of that is sort of renounced and given up, and whether or not the self is actually destroyed or there's just a kind of giving up or like a willingness for it to be destroyed is something that people talk about in different ways, and I have no opinion on that matter. But just something to be aware of, that you'll see kind of people talk about it in two different ways. People can sometimes talk about it in a very like extreme sort of way, which I think is worth not doing. Right. So from the grade of the Hesed grade, there's that crossing of the abyss, the letting go of the self, and also the idea that there's no longer a path, there's no longer a charted territory. It's a kind of plunge into the darkness of the unknown and a giving up of everything that you've known to be yourself and the world and all of that. And so the person who's like kind of undergoing this process or has just like come through this is called a Babe of the Abyss. And then the Babe of the Abyss like process leads to the entry into the Binah grade of the Magister Templi, right, the master of the temple. And then Crowley goes on to develop, the idea, the grades for Magus and Ipsissimus as well. Let me see. I'm trying to think of. There's so much like complex stuff to talk about. Let's see, maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of the first order work and how that like corresponds to the Sephiroth. Again, as I said, in Malkuth, you're working on a lot of really like foundational stuff, a lot of just really basic like ceremonial magic, ritual magic. You're working on the 4 powers of the Sphinx, right? Which is a really important correspondence. We talked about the Sphinx as corresponding to Malkuth, the Sphinx is corresponding to the elements, and that's a big part of the neophyte grade is the not just the study of the 4 powers of the Sphinx, right? And as I'm sure most of you are already familiar, the 4 powers of the Sphinx are to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silence. That you actually have to develop this practically, and there are tests set. There are sort of secret tests that you aren't told about in advance, because that would spoil the tests. But you are tested practically in your development of these 4 powers, and so we can see that as as a really great like Malkuth related self-development process, right? And then the path of Sheen and Kov are sort of worked in a very basic way in the Malkuth grade, but they're not fully traversed until afterwards. And so the path of Tav work, which again the neophyte, the AA initiate of Malkuth is working on the path of Tav as well. And Crowley talks about this as within the context of AA as like control of the astral plane. And so at least preliminarily, like the path of Tav here, which is like Saturn and also Earth and the universe, in the Atu 21 of the tarot. This is like control of the astral plane, Crowley calls it. And so you're learning to function in the astral. And once you've done this sufficiently, and once you actually can function in the astral, then you're basically in Yesod, you're starting to function in Yetzirah. And then the initiation to Yesod is the kind of final confirmation or fulfillment or cementing of that transition, which is mainly about the work of the path of Tav. And then again, as I said, in Yesod, you're doing some basic like Raja and Hatha Yoga practices related to like energy work and the subtle body. And then the paths of Sheen and Resh they're these kind of like what we now call like visualizations or guided meditations that relate to the 2 AA initiations. So it's hard to talk about that. You can read those practices in what's that Liber HHH, which some of you may be familiar with. That gives the practices for Sheen and Resh. And then in the 3 = 8 grade, this is Hod and Mercury, and this is where like a lot of the hard like Qabalistic study comes in, and the more like the intellectual development. It's important to note that in the AA grade, the 3 = 8, the practicus grade of AA is already quite high, and there are very few people that have actually gotten to that level. So though it might seem like not a very particularly exalted grade, it actually is quite far along, and you've been working for a number of years before you get there. And so you've been doing practical work, and now you do more of the intellectual development and more of the theoretical development that was less emphasized in the previous grades, because Crowley so much emphasizes practical experience and experimentation and all of that, and the direct apprehension of gnosis rather than the understanding of just sort of like abstract theoretical ideas. So a lot of that is developed in the 3 = 8 grade, as well as some other magical practices. In the 4 = 7 grade, I'm going to speed up a little bit here. In the 4 = 7 grade, attributed to Venus, and also to fire. This is where a lot of devotional work is done, the bhakti yoga, and choosing like a deity and doing some, fairly long-term devotional work with that deity as part of the philosophist grade. And you can see how you're developing the powers, of the self. Like in Netzach, you're developing the, the desire nature and, that bhakti and devotional nature. And in Hod, you're developing the, the intellect and the mind. And the Dominus Limnis grade sort of synthesizes all these things and brings them together into a single point. And then in the 5 = 6 grade, which is the center of the tree and attributed to to Fereth, to harmony, to beauty, and to the sun as well. That's an important attribution there. This is the Adeptus Minor grade, where the knowledge and conversation happens. The 6 equals 5 grade is very associated with the Adeptus Major, is very associated with the development of power. The 7 equals 4 grade is associated, the Adeptus Exemptus is associated with like the perfection of the individual. This is sort of the peak of an individual human's like a self-development. And then finally that is let go, the blood is poured out into the Grail of Babylon and the crossing of the abyss and into the Magister Templi grade, which is not especially worth talking about the nature of, since it's so far beyond what I and I assume most people here have any kind of ability to relate to in any sort of personal way. Yeah, again, there's so much more that could be said here, but I hope that's a good sort of introduction here. Yeah, let's just look at some further practices. So that basically wraps up everything. Again, if anybody has questions, comments, wants to share experiences they've had with doing the meditations, complaints or grievances, whatever you've got, now's the time. So anyways, some suggestions for further practices going forward. Just continue to work on your memorization practices, and slowly building up more and more. If you've got a lot of the basic things that I've been suggesting, start adding in some of the hierarchies, start memorizing the names of the archangels and the choirs of angels, or the names of the heavens of Messiah. Once you've got that basic structure and the core symbols built up, it becomes easier and easier to add like additional layers to that. And you can sort of let your own experience be your guide about how much you need to internalize and how much is fine to just be able to look up in tables whenever you need it. But just continuing that process of building that more and more and more, and continuing to revisit things. I think with all of this stuff, having a kind of cyclic way of relating to it is so important. You sort of start off and you gain and build competencies and expand your understanding larger and larger, but it's also important to sort of let go of all that, come back to the beginning and restart with the basics, because once you've seen more, then the basics will all look different from that new perspective. And so once you've gone into some of the deeper correspondences and the deeper structures, then you can go back and just start meditating on like just the Hebrew names of the grades, and think about beauty, think about mercy, think about the idea of a kingdom, think about a foundation, think about, wisdom, understanding, all those sorts of things. That's going to be very different after you've looked at a lot of the deeper structures than before you've done it. So again, this coming back again always to the basics and slowly like expanding your capacities. And then that especially intensifies when you start doing like meditations and ritual investigations. Being able to actually invoke the powers of the Sephiroth is going to give you a practical experience in a way that nothing else can. And of course, it's worth saying that the initiations, like whether in a Golden Dawn or an AA-based order, those also give a kind of direct practical experience of the Sephiroth and their nature and their kind of energetic qualities and the processes associated with them that sort of nothing else really can, especially in my experience. There's definitely been times where, I've taken initiation and then gone, oh, that's what that Sephiroth's about. You know what I mean? That it wasn't until going through that process that it became really clear to me. And I'm sure that will continue as I go on. So that's another, if you really, really want to go into depth with this, initiation is not necessary, but a great path. And again, talking about initiation, I want to reiterate that point that, whether you're working in a formal system, whether you're just starting out, whatever, you contain the entire tree and all four worlds. It can be a little bit limiting to think that, oh, I'm in Malkuth. I'm just, I'm a neophyte. I only know about Malkuth. I only know about Asaya. I don't know about anything else or something like that. That's a very like self-limiting way of looking at it. You're really focusing on that, and that's the thing that you are sort of most deeply and fully like competent in and aware of, but it's not the only thing that you have access to. You look at like the Jewish tradition, for example, in their meditation practices, they really talk about Chokmah and Bina consciousness, which I might have talked about this before, but like Bina consciousness is like structured consciousness, like what we call like discursive knowledge of separate ideas. Saying, oh, this thing is like this, but this thing is like this, right? Like structured intellectual knowledge. And then Chokmah consciousness is like formless awareness, which is something that while not necessarily easy to attain, is certainly not something that's reserved only for like a magus, someone who's crossed the abyss and done all the work of the Magister Templi and gotten to the grade of magus. That's something that a few dedicated years of meditation practice can absolutely achieve. And again, like the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition talks about those as Chokmah and Bina consciousness. So you can absolutely work with Chokmah and Bina consciousness, though obviously not in the same way that a Magister Templi or magus would be able to do that. I also, so yes, I see a couple comments coming in here, and I'll address those in just a second. Also, I suggest that you explore the Tree of Life using the tarot. Now that you've got the basics, I think, built up, now I think it can actually be really useful to explore using the tarot. And you can make up your own exercises. Just take your tarot deck and start sorting things out, in terms of the Sephiroth, like lay them out in different ways in terms of the Tree of Life, and come up with new kind of creative ways of using the tarot to explore all these ideas. One of the great things about the tarot is that, and you see this all the way back into the Jewish Kabbalah tradition, that there's a real like permutational logic of combining the different letters and combining the different ideas and going through all their different permutations as a way of meditating on these things and working with their powers, in a way of taking very simple structures and permuting them, right? Then you take the 4 elements and then kind of multiply the 4 elements by the 4 elements, and now you've got 16 sub-elements. Very simple, basic concepts when like applied to themselves or sort of multiplied by themselves, or you've got a set of 4, and it's like in astrology, for example, right? You've got like the 4 elements, the triplicities, and then the quadruplicities of cardinal, fixed, and mutable, and then you multiply that 4 and that 3 together, and then you've got the 12 signs. And then you take the 7 planets and multiply those by the 12 signs, and suddenly you've got an enormous complexity out of just a set of 3, a set of 4, and a set of 7. And the same thing absolutely applies to the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah. And I think the tarot is a great way of exploring that, because you can literally shuffle them up and permute them in all different ways, and put cards side by side with each other in all different combinations. And then finally, and especially if you went through the Paths, Letters, and Correspondences series that I did, or you investigated the paths on your own, you can start bringing those two things together and really thinking about how the different paths connect to the Sephiroth and what that tells you. Like, with the Fool, like how does the Fool and and Aleph, and all the significations that we talked about in that series of having to do with Aleph, how does that connect Kether and Chokmah, right? What's going on there? And you can think about like some of the number significance, right? Like the Fool can be associated with both the 0 and the 1, the moving from the non-existence to existence. I really like thinking about the Fool, especially the older versions of the Fool before the Book of Thoth version, like, the Crowley Harris version, where he's like stepping off the cliff as like the divine, sort of stepping off like the cliff of unity into manifestation. I really like that image, because it contains a little bit of some of the Gnostic insight, I think, about the nature of like unity and diversity, but is something, doesn't see it as it's a kind of cosmic accident, but there's something kind of playful and humorous and productive and like generative about it. It doesn't have to be like, something to wail and gnash your teeth about. So start meditating on that. Just look at the different paths and think, how does this connect, the two Sephiroth that it connects? And some really, really interesting stuff that you'll find when you do that. Some are more obvious than others. Some I think you'll get quicker, and some may take a long time or even practical experience to fully understand. But it's a great process to start working on. Let's see. So David says, Matthew, would TOS use the grades in more of the GD sense? It's no secret that the Temple of the Silver Star is a Golden Dawn pattern order. Yep, absolutely. And that's about all that I can say publicly. But the short answer is yes. All right, and then let's see. Kristen says, are there any books that describe the hierarchies in more detail? For instance, describing what is under the intelligences or Olympic spirits, or is there anything under them? This may be a stupid question. No, it's definitely not a stupid question. Of course, I think that the two main places to start with that would be, 777, and not just people always think of, 777, it's just the tables of correspondences, but there's some really great sections on the notes there too, and those can be really helpful for excuse me, like Crowley's notes on the correspondences. I think that can be really helpful for starting to understand those things. And Jim Eshelman's 776.5 which is really a kind of reorganization and cleaning up of a lot of the 777 material. And he's got his own notes section that are also very useful. There's a lot of classical sources that talk about this as well. There's a bunch of stuff like this in Agrippa and in some other classical sources, but not. Let me see, I might be just forgetting something. There's not any one particular thing that comes to mind. It's been probably about 6 years now since I read Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, but I believe there's some stuff in her book as well that gets into some of that stuff at least. But yeah, I'm not really coming up with a great book that, if anyone else can think of one, please chime in. But I'm not thinking of like one source that really like focuses on the natures of the hierarchies and explores those. But yeah, if I think of something, Kristen, I'll shoot you an email. But yeah, no, good question. So yeah, I mean, if there's nothing else, that wraps up our series. So like I was saying before we started, in November, we'll do, in November, I'll just do like just a one-shot standalone class. I have two different ideas, and I'm debating back and forth. If I get really ambitious, I might do 2 classes in November, but that's unlikely. I'll probably just do 1. And then in December, we'll do, it sounds like people, before class got started, were interested in the idea of a full-day workshop. So we'll talk about plan on like a full-day workshop on the pentagram and elemental magic in December. And then, again, this is sort of open to change, so stay tuned for announcements on Facebook or by email. So starting in January, maybe starting a series on planetary magic and hexagram rituals. That's the plan, at least. So yeah, thanks everybody. As always, for more information about either our academic or our initiatory track, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. There's my email address if you want to contact me about anything at all. And I can also add you to our public Google group. Though you can also probably find that just through Google Groups too. I'm not really sure how that works, but feel free to email me and I can add you. And then also, for anyone who's not a member, of either the academic or initiatory tracks, we have a $5 suggested donation that you can send to PayPal, but via PayPal to payments@tots.org. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. I really enjoyed doing this series. I learned so much in doing it. And it was great to have people's live questions, and I got some really great emails from a few of you. And some nice email conversations that we've been having. So I really appreciate all of that, and that was really helpful for me. And just the process of going through this has been really, really great. Yeah, thanks everybody. I really appreciate it. Let's see, I'll shut off the recording. Yeah, thanks everybody, and for anybody watching on YouTube or whatever, thanks for watching and listening, and yeah, see you all soon.